Good morning. Good morning, everybody. It's great to see you all here. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to this second morning session of our symposium, Liberal Sciences in a Changing Region, Challenges and Perspectives. It is telling that our two next speakers are both physicists. This underlines the importance of physics as a fundamental discipline in liberal art education, and it emphasizes the central role the physics department at AUB has played throughout AUB's history. It is a department that is among the oldest in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. It had internationally recognized the research activities in the 60s and the 70s before the war. It survived the Civil War while keeping its high academic standards. In '97, research picked up again, and physics is one of the 4 FAS departments which have reinstated its PhD program in 2007. Our first speaker today is my colleague in the physics department and my friend Jihad Touma. I've known Jihad ever since he joined our department in 1998, 98, October. Okay. After completing his undergraduate studies at the University of Texas at Austin, his PhD at MIT, and postdoctoral research at Austin and at the Canadian Institute of Theoretical Physics. In addition to being a world figure in the study of dynamical systems that include the evolution of planetary systems and the self-organization of swarms, with notably a recent paper that was published in Nature, Jihad is one of our most charismatic and devoted teachers. I recall during my first semester as chairman of the physics department, must have been like 13 years ago, he was assigned to teach freshman physics, classical mechanics 103, which is a physics course for non-physics majors. And after his class, I think I had most of his class coming to my office, the chairman's office. They looked worried, and they told me, Sir, Dr. Touma is asking us to walk down the sea corniche, look at the waves, observe natural phenomena, look at the flight of birds, and write about them. And he's asking us to keep a notebook that we have to update on a weekly basis and report natural phenomena and try to explain them. And they told me, sir, we're not used to this. What are we going to do? My first reaction, actually, was, well, frankly, I wish I had the opportunity to take a course with Jihad when I was an undergraduate student at AUB. I did not hear back from these students until much, much later in the semester. One of the students came, and she asked me, sir, is Dr. Touma a genius? Again, I did not comment. Since then, it's all with much anticipation that I await Jihad's talks and seminars, whether he's talking about on dynamical systems, on the acoustics of the eye. I'm trying to convince him to give us a lecture, hopefully next September, on his travels to India and to Asia. It is always with big anticipation that I await Jihad's lecture, and I think I can no longer wait for this one. So let's sit back and enjoy the representations of a scientist.
Thank you, Malik. I'm quite moved by the introduction and by the collegiality that we've shared over the years in the physics department. This is true of many of my colleagues in the department, despite the ups and downs over minor political issues. It's been a truly energizing place to be in. Before I start, I would like to first thank various kindred spirits with whom I've discussed matters related to this presentation because I'm sure I will forget names later on, and I really want them to be acknowledged. First, in the physics department, there is my dear colleague, Leonid, and our former dean and my current colleague, Khalil Bitar, with both of whom I've discussed matters scientific, the art of the making of science, as well as issues related to its administration. With Khalil, I'm talking to a seasoned administrator. With Leonid, I'm talking to a fellow distant from the administration. So I was getting balanced opinions from both. So I'm grateful for that. I'm also grateful for discussions of matters to do with the production of knowledge coming from colleagues in anthropology, sociology, around coffees and beers in town. Particularly Kirsten Scheid, with whom I discuss ways in which I'm talking about, what I'm talking about is mostly nonsense. And also discussions with Omar Diwaji about ungovernability, which actually suits a lot of what I'm about and what I'm proposing. And then discussions with Tamer Amin about the notion of communicating with the public, the science to a public. And then who else? Yes, Nadia Abu Ali recently in relationship to thinking critically in states of ruin. So all of these people have influenced me, and of course they bear full responsibility for anything not having anything to do with science in my lecture, which is practically everything. Okay, I'm joking, of course. All right, so I can proceed now without any further worries. So when I like to joke with my students that I've learned a lot by listening to Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah lecture on television. My lectures are generally highly disorganized, and he starts always his presentations with a clear plan and tries to stick to the plan and argues the reasons why he's not sticking to the plan as he progresses with the plan. So this has been far, far more useful to me in practice in classroom, and my students can attest to that, than anything I was shared from the Center of Teaching and Learning at the UB, with all respect to their great work. So here is my plan, and I keep it rough because I'm sure that I will be fluctuating stochastically between different categories as I talk. So there is a preamble, and the preamble, put pretentiously, is a genealogy of presence. Basically, this is a highfalutin way of saying the reasons why I'm here. Okay, so, and it probably will contain the bulk of the talk, so that is sort of almost the guarantee that if I run over time, that I've said everything I had to say at the beginning, okay? The second part is a fable, and it's a genealogy of a ruin. Yeah, that's how I would like to put it. I like to meditate on ruins. This is a venerable tradition in our poetry. It has been sort of discarded for reasons that I find totally difficult to understand. And I believe that ruin is highly inviting and a source of creativity, a ground from which one actually can be very productive. So the second part is the fable of a ruin, the genealogy of a ruin. And the third part has to do, and I have to stick to the rhymes, with rumbles. Yeah, these are rumbles that are holding promises for the future. And this is the most important part. So if I'm stuck on time, Helen, I hope you will allow me to jump to that part and go over it. Okay, so before I get into the subject of the lecture itself, let me talk about why I am here. So when I was given this invitation to come and lecture at this auspicious occasion, I, of course, was quite honored. But honor or possibilities of being honored are not a reason for me to contribute to an event. Rather, the most important reason is actually feeling troubled. Yes. So I felt troubled by this invitation because it sort of was implying that the marginal figure that I had carved for myself over years of being at AUB was somehow getting institutionalized in some fashion or the other. So the reason why I decided to accept is precisely this sense of being troubled. And I'm here to try to understand the reasons why I felt troubled and to actually articulate them in a way that gives expression to a general sense of trouble among colleagues who are functioning within the university. So yeah, so this is a lecture about the naming of that sense of being troubled. To be sure, as a scientist at AUB, I've carved myself a marginal position, which is caught naturally, interestingly, between sea and stairwell. Okay, so this is how I like to see it. I have the sea ahead of me, and I have a stairwell, and so I'm stuck, and I'm happily stuck. I've largely stayed away from things administrative, except to the extent that I put pressure on the tendencies to domesticate and normalize our works as scientists working in that stuck and particularly productive state. And I can say that the relationship to the administration has been one of creative negotiation over the years, in which I try to fulfill the statements of the mission of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences and the Department of Physics, while at the same time protecting encroachment of my island of creative work, which I like to see as fostering a sense of apprenticeship model for the production of science, which is largely outdated, I would say, in the context of the configurations of scientific production institutions that are taking place around us. So I set for myself this challenge, and I thought about this challenge in perfectly pragmatic ways. My work can indicate the viability of this experiment. Also, the lack of work is an acceptable argument by the administrators to do away with the experiment. But I was fully convinced by the value of this experiment, by maintaining this experiment, by sustaining this experiment, and by fighting for its existence. And so far, so good. So this is at least partly in relationship to why I accepted to give that talk. To be sure, I'm no expert on anything I will be talking about in this discussion. I'm not a historian of science. I'm not a sociologist of knowledge. I am not a historian of AUB, for that matter, which is precisely why I feel empowered to talk about these matters. Yes, expertise has never been a hurdle for me to talk about things or to talk to experts with the attitude of an expert. This is, I think, what a university atmosphere should be fostering. And so instead, much of what I will be talking about is generated in very intimate discussions with kindred spirits, people who share our sense of discontent about how things are moving within academia, people who are in some way or the other seeking solution, support, in a context which is increasingly bureaucratizing their attempt at producing meaningful knowledge in this enclave by the sea, as I like to talk about it. So within that context, we would come together and mull over things, and it is within that setting that much of the ideas, concerns, questions were raised for me and for others, and I'm going to try to give voice to some of these things in my discussion. To be sure, such matters, or talking about such matters publicly, involves some levels of vulnerability. It also involves some level of sincerity, both of which are actually at the heart of what it is for me to be doing fundamental science. So I will be talking about things non-scientific while appealing to the tools, the creed that I go by as a scientist. I hope you will tolerate my switching to some written text. So it was clear for me from the start that it could not be about my science, that this presentation could not be about my science, about what keeps me awake at night and its portent for the next 150 years. Okay, surely it has significance for the next 150 years. We're discovering a slew of exoplanetary systems. We're looking at questions of life in the universe, and these systems are surely informing these questions in fundamental ways which we'll be addressing with much excitement in the coming 150 years. So it's not that I did not consider that possibility, but I found it too pretentious, okay, to be doing that for this auspicious audience, and particularly with the absence of any community of specialists in that field of mine, that precious hobby of mine, to justify the excitement, okay? For the self-deprecating fellow that I am, and I concluded that it would double my sense of ample embarrassment of being in the position I accepted to put myself in, okay? So that is out of the question, and Helen's prodding was sort of overkill. I had already decided I will not be talking about my science. By the time she told me, Jihad, try to talk about things of social scientific concerns. I was already in that track by the time we discussed. Then I thought I could perhaps divert the focus of my position by decentering and shedding light on the works of people in my community I truly care about, and whose scientific work I'm truly concerned with, but whose work I've had hardly any occasions to follow closely. So I thought I would take the opportunity to learn about the work of my dear friend and colleague Kamal Maqdisi in mathematics, and a fellow who deals with esoteric matters of number theory, but which have profound applications for matters to do with cryptography. I know that Kamal was approached to discuss these issues in public, and I know he shied away from the request, and I thought that my knack for trying to simplify things with appropriate checking for Kamal for accuracy, of course, I may offer to do that service for him. I thought also that I would try to shed light on Kamal's work in relationship to community building in relationship to mathematics, spending years working with high school students to inspire them to interest with mathematics at a pedagogic level that I know he is superbly capable of. I also thought of the work of my colleague in physics department, Leonid Klushin, who is a fellow dealing with polymers of both industrial and biophysical applications. And the 21st century, for sure, is going to be the century for such applications and their mining. So I thought maybe I'll try to find out what he's been up to recently. I also thought of people in biology like Diana Jalou, or the Lord of the Flies, Zakaria Cambrils, my very good friend whose work I find particularly exciting in its gruesomeness. So I thought I will be talking about all of these guys. I even thought I will be talking about my good friend Lara Halawi, who dabbled with administration and felt the yearning and the call to be back in the lab very strongly, and I'm very proud about her decision. And I'm looking forward to the implications of her work on nanotechnology in the 21st century. So I thought of basically, okay, I'll be in this position talking about all these wonderful people. And here I'm restricting myself to people in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. I'm inspired largely by people in engineering, Alan Shahadi, Ghanem Awais, people whose work is interfacing among fields and also interfacing with the public. So I'm proud to be actually associated and in touch with these people, and I thought this is the right occasion to be talking about them. But then I thought that by doing that, I will actually be rather optimistic about things, right? I mean, I will describe optimism about a very narrow space in which beautiful things are happening, and I would overlook all the pressure on that space, right? All the pressure to actually either normalize that space or eliminate it altogether. Okay? I said, no, I'm not going to give the FAS that favor. No. I'm going to give it another favor, the favor of challenging it, which is, I think, what good children are supposed to do within the context of their families. Yes, that's what I teach my son, at least. Okay, so, fine. Let me catch up where I was. Okay. So in approaching the question of the representation of the scientist, someone like myself who has already accepted that his position as a scientist does not give him any normative ground to stand on. Okay, so you see, I'm no scientific naturalist. Okay, and I've long time ago given up on the sense that science is going to improve matters in any significant ways. Okay, I'm sorry to disappoint the nanotechnologists in the audience. Okay. I have given up on that hope. I'm actually speaking from a totally hopeless position with the sense that change remains possible. Okay, that's paradoxical, but this is the way things are. Okay, so for a scientist like myself who has already accepted that his position as a scientist does not give him any normative ground to stand on, except that is for the incessant imperative of undermining grounds for standing. Okay, that is my position as a scientist, is to make it very difficult for me to speak. For someone in that position, going over typologies of scientists in the context of the representation of science is largely a matter of entertainment, through caricatures as one attempts to lighten the dismal state vis-à-vis any semblance of the public sphere that is left for scientists in our setting. Of course, I'm not the first to be speaking about that. My friend Omar pointed me to a beautiful paper by Weber on the science as a vocation. So he had already articulated this disenchantment of the scientist and the marginalization of the scientist in the evolving socioeconomic context of the times. And as often happens, sociologists are preceded by novelists. And again, I'm not the first one to be saying that. And so Flaubert, in his Éducation sentimentale, as I recall from my very good French baccalaureate, had touched on these issues already in relationship to his dilettante of characters and the sense of malaise that they were finding themselves in relationship to a social milieu that was essentially leaving them with very little space to play in, except as collaborators with a setting that had very little to do with the values that they presumably espoused. So sellout, essentially. So the options either you go silent, okay, you go into exile, or you sell out, okay? That's basically the picture. Now, Weber, to be sure, did leave room for alternatives, okay? Weber left room for alternatives, and his room for alternatives was to say, okay, so there is a sense in believing in ideas, in having convictions. That's how he called it, okay? So you're allowed to have convictions, but you should not take your convictions so seriously as to think that their implementation should be entrusted to you. Now, that much I am very convinced by as well. As a scientist, I do not like to think of myself as someone who is going to provide policymakers or to actually be in a position to inform policy. If anything, it will be the opposite. It will be to question policymakers and to question the ground from which policy is being made in the first place. Now, in relationship to that position of conviction, Weber also left room for the possibility of responsibility. So there is a connection between conviction and responsibility is essentially the expression of that political vocation in people, i.e. the ability to take convictions and translate them into realizable political programs within a given entity. So in some sense, I'm here to give voice to convictions and looking for potential allies among those who feel responsible enough or interested enough to articulate these convictions in a matter that is viable. I will give indications of directions for viability in this lecture. I will also give indications for the threats that we are going through from one single angle in this lecture, though I have a number of tracks that I have thought about in discussion with colleagues over the years. The angle I've chosen to speak from is one that is related to the scientist in relationship to the public sphere. Okay? And the public sphere is, of course, is a concept that is heavily debated and discussed within the social sciences, Habermas having given articulation to that concept and made it his business to almost evangelize for the public sphere in the world with a largely Germanic background in mind. I'm not sure how this is bearing out within the social sciences themselves, but I found it interesting as a starting point to think about the scientist at the 21st century. So as I said, I will flip through just an initial stage of thinking about typologies of scientists in our upbringing. And of course, Tintin was the source for any respectable model of a scientist in our setting. In fact, this was the point of reference among my peers. So here is the absent-minded scientist at work, highly focused on experiments, totally disconnected from the setting. Then there is, of course, the prophet at work. Okay, so he's the harbinger of doom. He's a guy. By the way, all the scientists in Tintin were men, as far as I can tell. There were very few women to speak of anyway. Okay, so there is the prophet at work. Then there is the guy who calculates, takes his calculations very seriously, albeit with heavy mistakes to the point that it can disrupt the life of a whole nation. So this is what I think of as scientific naturalism. Then there is the public servant. Okay, so here is the scientist now entrusted with a mission. He is entrusted with a mission by politicians. And we know many such examples in the 20th century, of course, who've contributed to the atom bomb program, as well as to the control of atomic energy in the world, Oppenheimer in particular. But I also think of scientists who also want to serve the scientific tradition from their heart. They're very dedicated to the sustaining of spaces in which science is produced at a level that is transformative, both of the academic environment and the environment around it. So I thought of the example of Dean Bitar, who came to the sciences from a tradition of being a physicist himself. And then I went back to the history of the department. I thought of Antoine Zahlan, who went from our department to actually thinking about scientific production in the Arab world at large. He was particularly obsessed with the notion of the brain drain, which I don't see any problem with at all personally, but that's a matter for another discussion. So in going over this review, it would have been my objective, had I taken this track in the talk, to actually try to argue for making space for many more good mad scientists. Okay, and here I'm showing the beautiful portrait of Tesla, who I'm sure will appeal to Edgar in the audience. So here is Tesla, a fellow who revolutionized many fields he was involved in a largely amateurish fashion. Okay, so this is this mad scientist as an amateur, left to him or herself to do their work, while others take care of very, very important responsibilities, I'm sure. Of course, the thing that one wants to try to avoid is the proliferation of evil mad scientists, okay? And here I put evil between quotes because Duchenne, when he actually undertook his work, was an inspiration for me as a fellow who thought deeply about photography at some point. So here, there is a concern with human expression, okay? So we're trying to generate human expressions with meticulously controlled stimulations of various muscles in the human face. Okay, questionable in some sense. I'm sure it won't pass any of our procedures for vetting research experiments in this university, but it was done outside the walls of universities at the time and been an inspiration for artists and scientists ever since. Okay. I will argue against bad mad scientists, but I will certainly be also questioning rules and regulations and pressures that are encouraging the growth of what I like to think about as a cunning bureaucracy of scientists, okay? So I use the word cunning very positively here because I think of bureaucrats as people who are trying to deal with extremely strenuous economic pressures, largely untenable, okay, and finding interesting ways to resolve these pressures to make ends meet. So we are seeing these bureaucrats. I'm sure you know a few yourselves. You drive in, you go to your classroom, you launch Moodle, you punch buttons, you flip through PowerPoints. Everybody seems totally disconcerted with what you're doing. You are also disconcerted with what you're doing. You leave your classroom, you pass by a lab, you push a few buttons, you clock at 5, you leave, go for a walk at the Corniche, and you go home. Okay? That's quite reasonable as a solution, and I don't have any problem with it. Okay? It's prevalent. It's up to the administration to deal with it, not my problem. In fact, I find it far more interesting as a solution to these unbearable or highly inconsequential constraints than the category of willing technocrats, okay? So these are people who have decided, okay, there is interest in my work. There is relevance for my work. My work can turn into policy. I can hang out with people in television stations. I can hang out with politicians. I can go to parliament. Look, I'm a star. I can do it, okay? And the technocratic model has had its totalitarian perspectives. Here I picked a snap from my favorite film on the subject, Alphaville, where one is invited to respect silence, logic, security, and prudence. Okay? This is a technocratic direction that the university is taking. It sort of puts it in various terms. It couches it in various motivations. But largely what is at stake here is sources of funding in my reading and the adjustment of research mandates to fulfill these funding initiatives, to turn the university somehow into a glorified think tank, or to invite it to turn into a series of NGOs, actually doing the work of NGOs, whereas we should be in the position of questioning the mandates of NGOs, the premise of their work, the way they define their work, their mission, and perhaps kicking them out in large numbers altogether. No, I don't see much of that happening. Okay, so now I come to the part. So I've talked about all the things I'm not talking about, okay? So I've taken a lot of time so far to talk about things I'm not talking about, and that's not a nice thing to be doing in a festive occasion, right? You come talk about the impossibilities. No, I'm not going to leave it at that, okay? I'm not going to leave it at that. So I had other things to say. No, I'm actually quite positive. So far so good about things I'm in no position to talk about. Still, I would not accept to join a celebration in order to share impossibilities, right? With it, even though much that I do thrives on such impossibilities. In fact, much of my science has to do with cutting through impossibilities. So here is something positive I'm here to say, all right? Okay, somebody wants to talk to me. I should try to silence them somehow. Okay, I take it as self-evident. Okay, this is the concluding remark. Okay, this is my concluding remark. I will start talking after that. So I take it as self-evident that there is something materially, historically singular about this experiment with which I've associated myself for the last decade and a half, the experiment of organizing the production and transmission of scientific knowledge that is called AUB. Okay? I take it as self-evident. There is something singular enough about it that is worth sustaining in its singularity. Okay? So there is something worth sustaining in its singularity, the singularity of its context, the singularity of what it ultimately protects in that environment. I also believe that protecting that singularity is best done by further driving the eccentricities rather than by taming them with formulaic solutions of various motivations, some associated with the latest development in academic thinking in the US, in Germany, in Europe, whatever. They're very interesting. I read them. I find them relevant. But I have my context to be dealing with. I have to leave my university, walk through neighborhoods, get to my home, and this all gives me reasons for reflections and questioning that I cannot leave behind. All right? So that singularity can be maintained by reinventing itself at all scales and in direct dialogue with the singularities of the space within which it thrives, rather than in the comfortable insulation of expertise interfacing with policymakers of public interest with no public in the equation to speak of. Okay? So here is the expert talking about public interest with the public largely absent from any discussion. Of course, I'm insulated. What do you expect me to do? I mean, I'm producing results. Okay? In other words, no solutions from the mean, and here perhaps Nassim Taleb has something to say on the matter. In other words, no solutions from the mean can serve an outlier of an experiment like AUB. Why do we keep trying to normalize ourselves where 150 years, founding father, followed by presidents, followed by a generation of truly wonderful administrators in very, very difficult times, have been discussing the singularity of this experiment? Why do we keep trying to find solutions that have been tried or try to normalize ourselves in the relationship to one accreditation exercise on one form or the other? I would like to confess to my deans that I've hardly participated willingly in any such experiments. I think of myself as a zoo animal in a circus when I'm asked to perform such experiments. And I hope that this is well heard. Okay, so in other words, no solutions from the mean can serve an outlier of an experiment. We need to continuously be alert and busy with the art of reinventing ourselves. This is this challenge I set for myself in being part of this community. This is the challenge I ultimately accepted to speak for by accepting to speak here today. Okay, I'm done. You can applaud. Okay. Now that I've accepted the challenge to speak here today, let me actually give you a take on a point of attack I chose to take in relationship to the issues of the day. Okay, so there are a number of ways that we can describe our dismal predicament as scientists working in this enclave. Well, it's not so dismal. I have wonderful people to bemoan the state of this condition with, so I'm happy about that. Yes. So the ways to take singularities and amplify them is to understand all of the ways in which singularities were tamed. And one way to do it is philosophically. Okay, I attempted to do it philosophically, and I thought I would sound extremely pedantic. Perhaps I already sound pedantic as it is. So then I said, okay, the right way to do it is to do it as a scientist would do. Give an example of what I'm really talking about, and then attempt to actually talk about ways out that are already burgeoning in our environment as we speak. Okay, so I decided to start with this notion of the relationship of science and the public sphere. Okay, I'm not going to define any of the terms in that statement, neither science nor the public sphere. I'll take it as self-evident. If you have a problem with it, you can refer to Google after the lecture and find your favorable thing. I am sure you have your own ideas about what I'm talking about. Okay, so I decided that one starting point for my discussion today will be the crisis of 1882. And often this crisis is discussed in relationship to questions of science and religion, very important. Questions of academic freedom, equally important. Okay? What I found inspiring, in fact, the reason why I wanted to talk here, I really wanted to talk here, was the inspiration I felt in relationship to the guys who actually were involved in that crisis. Okay, here I am showing a cutting from a writing by one of my heroes. Okay, I'm showing a cutting by one of my heroes, namely Mansour Jourda, who was a tremendous popularizer of science in Arabic language that was showing a great flexibility, playfulness, and beauty. Here he is actually reporting much later in his career, having left AUB, on his impression of what that crisis was about, and he describes it as the first truly revolutionary movement within an academic setting in the Arab world. Okay? Now this is very impressive, and I'm equally impressed by what his point of view on this crisis. Now, his point of view, I share a lot with it, and it will come across my discussion. My point of inspiration in relationship to this crisis was the notion of risk. Okay, risk-taking that was embedded within that community, both of liberal educators, largely missionaries at the time, the leading educators, and their students. Okay, tremendous sense of commitment to ideas. Wrong or right is immaterial. Were they fully cognizant of the implications of Darwin's idea at the time? It's largely immaterial. What is fundamental is their decision to take a stand and to their ability to organize around that stand, to articulate it, and to find ways to survive once their stand meant the end of their livelihood as scientists. This is what I found particularly inspiring in that moment, and what I find particularly lacking in our current setting. And it is understanding the lack of this level of commitment to convictions that forced me or encouraged me to pursue this track. So, of course, one of the figures behind that whole tradition, in some sense, coming from the missionary setting itself, is Cornelius van Dijk, Al-Hakim as he was called, a truly remarkable fellow, an embedded Orientalist if I've ever seen one, perhaps a Sejiger before his time, somebody who decided to espouse the values of academic freedom, to commit himself to scientific ideas irrespective of religious edicts of one form or the other, who had his son follow suit and undertake a study of Syrian dogs with which he was in communication with Darwin, who actually helped advise two of the leading figures in that movement, Yaqub Sarrouf, who is shown here seated with a fez, and Faris Nimr, two bright guys, one dedicated to physics, math, the other to astronomy, incredible fellows, incredible energy, but at the same time, youthful, I would say boyish excitement about the possibilities of science in transforming society and the world. I don't share their excitement, but I'm highly inspired by their energy. Okay, so Van Dyke, a few students, and then a coterie of students in the medical school managed to form a cohesive unit, okay, in terms of dynamical interactions about the issues. They weren't all of a single mind. There was a lot of division, a lot of debate, a lot of discussion taking place around the issues, and one felt informed discussion and a strong political experience behind it in relationship to organizing in a space of learning. That I found very inspiring. With Van Dyke's encouragement, Sarrouf and Nimmer launched this amazing experiment in the popularization of scientific work, and in fact the pamphleteering for the importance of scientific development in relationship to society, state building, the solutions of a variety of problems from the household to things to do with the skies. They formed something called al-Mukhtataf, okay, علمية صناعية, as they call it. And here one sees the reference to Yaqub Sarrouf as معلم الفلسفة الطبيعية والرياضيات, okay, so natural philosophy and mathematics, and Faris Nimmer as معين في المرصد, okay, ومعلم في علم الهيئة, an astronomer. Both of these guys were thought of in terms of categories of labor as native tutors, okay? So in some sense, the stories of that crisis is the story of native tutors taking the teachings of their masters, okay, and some of them were called masters, okay. So native tutors taking the teaching of their masters far more seriously than they ever intended them to do, okay. And this is very interesting. This happens all the time in the relationship to experiments in missionary, benefactory, seemingly innocuous form of learning. So this is not new. What these guys did is to offer their magazine as a space for the publication of the commencement address of Lewis, okay? And that commencement address is infamous for having referred highly to the scientific method of Darwin at a time when this work was not thought of positively. So the title of that piece of work has to do with knowledge, science, and wisdom, a trilogy which remains, I think, very important for any discussion in liberal arts setting right now. Okay, I have to silence this completely. Okay, and by doing that, these guys undertook a tremendous risk, okay? By doing that, these guys undertook tremendous risk. Really? 10 minutes? Okay. Well, okay, I'll go by audience vote. I'll go by audience vote. Eddie, do you have a problem if I spill over? No. Okay. I have friends in the audience. Okay, so these guys took tremendous risk by actually offering the pages of their newspaper to the ideas that were being promulgated and discussed at the time. They were far ahead of Lewis's article already in support and highly excited about the promise of Darwinian thought and its implications. They've already published works by William Van Dyke in relationship to that same matter. So they were already highly radicalized around these issues. And so it's not surprising to see them take these risky decisions. But in some sense, one needs material conditions within which to function. And one has to keep in mind that there was some sort of burgeoning public sphere to speak of at the time, which gave them the courage to function the way they did. At least this is my thesis. And that public sphere has to do, for instance, with the proliferation of scientific societies. They were modeling themselves perhaps after other societies of the periods and the times. Here is an account of the proceedings of a meeting of the Syrian Society of Arts and Sciences reported by Ellie Smith. Okay, and here we see a list of the kind of lectures given in that meeting. So we see a discourse on the instruction of women by Boutros al-Bustani. We see a discussion on the origin of commerce and its vicissitudes by Mikhail Medjour, on Prosperity and Adversity by Mikhail Mishaka. And Mikhail Mishaka, together with Boutros Boustany, are very important figures for me. Boutros, as a useful guy, we learn about Boutros in relationship to the Renaissance, of course, the guy behind Muhit al-Muhit. I was always impressed by the notion of Muhit al-Muhit. So, and I remain impressed by that notion. For an encyclopedist, he was a remarkable fellow. Even more remarkable is the stately figure of Mikhail Mishaka. Okay, and this fellow I encountered first in relationship to a treatise on Arabic music. He was self-educated by and large. Okay, the guy was self-educated by and large, autodidact, studied medicine, thought about all sorts of matters and wrote about them, but he was particularly influential in putting a treatise on Arabic music where he was the first to understand its structure in relationship to quarter tones and give a very detailed account of that structure with examples. He was, of course, influenced by fantastic teachers of the time, but he did us the favor of putting it in writing, okay, which is something truly, truly incredible for somebody to have done it all by themselves. We're seeing him here as, I think, the first United States vice consul in the Levant, okay? So then, of course, there is Van Dyck. A lot is said about Van Dyck. He's one of the founding fathers, but he's a guy who basically studied language, taught in that language, wrote textbooks in that language, then studied medicine, then contributed to the teaching of medicine, defended various point of views, supported students, allied himself with them. A remarkable fellow, to say the least. I certainly feel like I would have liked to hang out with him and discuss Darwin in that setting. Now, what Van Dyck was particularly instrumental for, was to translate his passion for astronomy into the building of a space for the study of astronomy, the study of the skies. So it was to him that we owe the initiative to put together this, one of the most beautiful structures on campus, beautiful in terms of beauty as well as in terms of engineering feats that went into making it the stable structure for astronomy that it is. So it was this fellow's passion that led to the coming together of this structure and the putting together of a space, among other spaces, by the way, which were in some sense seeking to deal with science, its generation, as well as its sharing it with the public. Okay? So already the university was committed to interfacing around knowledge with the public. So here I'm showing older pictures, which were kindly given to me by my colleagues and now friends in the archives. Pictures associated with the Museum of Natural History, the Lee Observatory again, and the Museum of Geology. Of course, there is the post-herbarium as well, which survives in the present thanks to the work of people like Salma Al-Hou and the increasingly vibrant energy that is showing through the Nature Conservancy Center. An experiment is in public outreach that's definitely noteworthy for all of us to think about. So land, sea, and sky were in some sense translated into spaces for the display and the opening of spaces for public entry into these environments and engaging that public around these environments. Now, to be sure, the observatory was not always open to the public. Robert West was adamant about not letting any public entry into the space because he felt that he was, I think, a very gifted administrator. He felt that if he let one or two people on a certain occasion, he will have difficulty justifying not letting many more people on more frequent occasions. So he decided, okay, forget it altogether. But I think it's fair to describe that space as a liminal space. And this is what I find so exciting about it. Okay? It's a space which has, from the start, been a space for, one, the expression of passions. Highly entrepreneurial passions. Okay? Story after story shows people putting in their money to refurbish a piece of equipment, putting in their money to buy a piece of equipment, putting their life at stake in order to protect the equipment, putting their energy in order to make the knowledge generated in that observatory relevant to the community. Of course, it wasn't only an observatory of the skies. It was also a meteorological station, as well as ultimately a seismographic station, which failed miserably as soon as the tramway was introduced on Bliss Street. So the vibration that it induced were not ones that the instrument was designed for. Okay? So it's a space in which passion was expressed. It is a space in which people felt like translating these passions into energy that was highly infectious. I read stories of people sleeping in the observatory for a month on end to carry out the observational campaign. I read stories of people meticulously undertaking meteorological observations and sharing them with various outlets in town. I read about their interest in putting effort to develop increasingly sophisticated models for lunations to share with the Mufti's office, in some cases without his knowledge, in the sense that they rather not indicate a strong connection between a scientific establishment and a religious establishment. So this was there in that environment, and it remained there till the end of its days. Now, that environment for me is a metaphor for the kind of science I'm trying to talk about. Risk, personal risk, passion, and an interest in actually communicating that science with, I am sure, a voracious public. So in that space, when Owen Gingerich came as the head of the observatory, it was opened to the public for the first time. One day a week, the public was allowed into the observatory. And here, Al-Allama Mansour Jirdak is talking about an interesting anecdote associated with the observation of the moon, a scene that he had witnessed firsthand. Now, open nights were also auspicious nights, okay? So here in 1957 is a remarkable scene, remarkable in many respects, showing Mansour Jirdak in the face, in the foreground. It shows Charles Malik in the background, looking carefully to make sure that President Chamoun is either not doing anything excessive to hurt the instrument or hurt himself. That's my guess. There are a number of people in the background. I think I am guessing one of them is associated with the Ksara Observatory, but I'm not sure who's who, actually. Now, this is in 1957. 1958, Chamoun had more serious business to deal with, and eventually the Civil War brought Charles Malik and Chamoun on the same table as members of the Lebanese forces at the time. Very interesting developments. I find this picture particularly inspiring. Now, Mansour Jirdak himself was an astronomer who was dedicated to the study of variable stars, among other things. But what I found remarkable about reading his works, his writings, is his knack for popularizing. Okay? Tremendous, tremendous Arabic. At some point, I follow him trying to convey to the reader a sense of the scales in space by taking as a reference a point on the page on which he's writing the article. So the article becomes a reference for the scales that enter into his description of the universe. Extremely poetic, and worthy of further study. Then we had a member of our department, Franz Bruin, whom I don't know too much about otherwise. I didn't get the chance to meet him neither as a high schooler nor later as a faculty member. Here he's shown giving expression to his total passion with the history of astronomy, and actually recreating instruments that people were using or describing in the treatise that he was reading. That instrument, which is a perfectly functioning instrument, now sits on Emil Bustani. Okay? Now, as you go down past Emil Bustani in the physics department, you look up and you see this armiery sitting up there. Its function is totally nebulous to most of us in this community, I am sure. Okay, so this fellow translated, his interest in doing physics as soon as he landed here from a background in spectroscopy to an increasing interest, which reflected the atmosphere at the university and the history of astronomy. So actually, he's most famous in physics for having provided one of the more accurate theories for predicting the first appearance of the lunar crescent. Okay? A very, very touchy and physically difficult issue, I might add. Now, 1979, the Lee Observatory shuts down, okay? So I will track this shutdown and its transformation through the various plaques that decorate the building. Obviously, it is a liminal state in the sense that the administrations that followed had no idea what to do with it, okay? We have no idea what to do with it. So it's the old observatory building in 1874. Then in 1980, it turns into the Arts and Sciences Conference Center. Okay, that's a cool idea. Why not? Okay, and then it actually gets inhabited by the people who are concerned with the planning of our real estate. Okay, the FPDU, all right? So pretty dismal situation, I must say. Now, the telescope itself, the telescope is sitting on its pedestal with a dome that is no longer operational, but this is in no way an impediment for the reconstruction of the instrument, as I will describe later on. There is a beautiful phrase. يا خلص الوقت؟ من زمان خلص الوقت. طيب لكن هذا الموضوع الأساسي. The shutdown of the public sphere, the shutdown of the dome itself, the shutdown of the space for any coupling to the sciences, in some sense, has been discussed in sociology for years. Its manifestation in our setting is the degree to which astrologers, okay, astrologers have become the space in which the skies are talked about. In fact, if you're an astronomer functioning in the land and you want to have an opportunity to appear on television, it is through the program of somebody like, say, Maggie Farah, for whom I have a great respect, okay? Great respect as a figure serving her profession. So nature abhors a vacuum, and Maggie Farah is aptly filling that vacuum in more ways than one. Even more interesting is Mr. Tomb, Dr. Samir Tomb, okay? Now, Dr. Samir Tomb describes himself as the premier Lebanese astronomer, okay? He doesn't use the word munajim, okay? He uses the word falaki, okay? He's a falaki. He's not a munajim. And he's a guy who can deal with stone throwing in the sand. He can read your future. He can feel your future. He's impressive. Okay, so these are the guys we have to contend with at this stage. Okay, but there is hope. Now I'm going to talk about hope. Okay, so there is hope. Okay, there is hope. And the hope I started feeling suddenly from various circles. And in physics, we speak about phase transitions. And one is feeling, yes, this is the beginning of a phase transition. Various things happening in various places simultaneously, touching on similar issues and perhaps leading to dramatic transformations. So I have hope in the initiative of my friend and colleague Tamer Amin and the Center for Math and Science Education here at AUB, his initiative for taking science and math to the public. Okay, I have great hope for that initiative, not because it wants to actually transform our knowledge and to package knowledge to the broader community, but because it wants to share with the community the process of knowledge making, its frailties and its certainties. That I find extremely promising. I also have hope, and I'm sure you share that hope. I mean, after all I have said, the only thing that can happen with this space is that it turns into the natural space in which the lectures that Tamer Amin imagines actually take place. Okay? So I hope that FPDU designed themselves out of the Lee Observatory in my lifetime. That's my hope. Okay? And I'm ready to support their initiative, do the fundraising, and perhaps find the appropriate source of technical advice in doing that. Yes, FPDU can design itself out of a situation. Yes, this is possible. Now, another source of hope is associated with the work of a number of colleagues here at AUB, Nadia Abu Ali and friends, through the Beirut Institute for Critical Analysis and Research. Now, this is an institute which I know very little about so far. I've attended a few of their lectures. I'm mystified by their language. I'm intrigued enough to want to attend more lectures, okay? But what I found fantastic about this institute is that it decided it wants to take critical discourse into a public space. So where are they to be found? In Mar Mikhail, of all places. A bunch of very serious academicians getting together, discussing, opening a space, a platform for deep discussion of the sciences. This is something to be hopeful about, okay? I'm also hopeful for the work of a very close friend of mine, Professor Albert Naqash. I think of him as a solo in Ras Beirut. He's a professor of ancient languages, but also truly a polymath, vast knowledge of history, archaeological issues, vast swath of temporal phases, who has the dream, with increasingly interest from a wider community, to provide an interesting evolutionary model for the processes by which culture has evolved over large periods of time. Okay? So here he is describing the state of cultural artifacts or development in early Paleolithic areas. Okay, this is about 40,000 years BC, and in an area of 2,000 humanoids. And then moving on to 4,000 BCs to 300,000 population, and dramatic transformation in the cultures. His question is, are there mechanisms that we can try to apprehend by which this happens? And he does that pretty much in a solitary fashion in a neighboring apartment here in Ras Beirut. And he's certainly a big source of hope for me for what science can do in Ras Beirut. Finally, I will end with this space for the production of knowledge. I'd like to think of it as a place in which Ibn Khaldun meets Al-Khwarizmi. Okay, so Ibn Khaldun is a fellow who spent his years trying to advise failing forms of government. Okay, this is a caricature, but this is pretty much true. He had the interest of being an advisor to the governance of his time, and then finally, okay, gave up. Things are far too tumultuous for me to actually contribute anything meaningful, and decided instead to write a theory about how this fluctuation actually comes about. And then Al-Khwarizmi is the guy who deals with mathematics, algorithmics. So I think of the work that is being done in Iqlim, which is an outfit here in Jeffinor, led by my friend Hassan Al-Asad and a crew of very gifted computer scientists and engineers, to provide a map for these fluctuations that are taking place in Middle East, which is certainly at the brink of catastrophe in many respects. But catastrophe has never been a reason not to dream and do amazing work in the Middle East. Hassan al-Assad are providing maps for the geopolitical fluctuations that are taking place in our neighborhood, Syria in particular, but also extending to much larger scales to deal with the questions of water and electrical shortages on a worldwide dimension. This is data for us scientists and mathematicians to play with and to construct our favorite models with, and perhaps test some of Nassim Taleb's proposition for anti-fragility in series with grounded data and not just mathematical extrapolations. With this, I end my exercise. Thank you.